AMD just reported their Q2 earnings, and we can see that its stock is up almost 6% in the after hours. I think this was kind of expected. The stock has been tanking ever since it peaked in around 1 month ago, over 180 US dollar, locally at least. And it's then kind of been down to 135 just earlier today. So in my opinion, because the stock took such a beating over the past 4 or 5 weeks, it was just, realistic to expect, a nice beat in terms of fundamentals. And why do I say that? So if you look at the actual numbers, the revenue came in at 5.8. That in itself is not a big, let's say beat. They guided for 5.7 plus minus 300 million. So 5.8 is essentially in the middle of the park. But the interesting are the details, where does this, let's say 9% increase year on year come from? Because if you look more in details, you can see that if you look at the segmentations, so let's have a look at here. You'll see that data center doing good, up 21%. Client doing fairly good, up almost 10%. Gaming, doing abysmally bad, 30% down, and operating income is almost 50% down. And embedded is essentially flat. And we know that embedded has been weak for quite a while now. Although Lisa Su talks about over the past 3-4 quarters that the second half of 2024 will be some kind of recovery. So let's see, for Q3 and Q4, or at least early next year. But if you forget embedded being flat and gaming being really, really bad, so essentially most of the, most of the beat comes from these two segments, data center and client. Data center is almost half of their revenue, or in all honesty, it is essentially 50% of their revenue now. So this is not at Nvidia levels, where it is 90%. Or thereabouts. We are now, but at least very close to 50% of AMD sales comes from data center. We know traditionally maybe 1 billion or $1.5 billion is from the servers, their traditional general purpose EPIC CPUs, and then the rest would be, so if you assume 1.5 billion for EPIC, that leaves 1.3 billion for MI300. So that gets really interesting. But before we look at the details of MI300 and how important this 2.8 billion is, let's have a look at client. So we know that the client is, their laptops, laptop CPUs and some part GPUs for laptops, but essentially CPUs for laptops and APUs. Last Sunday, they launched their new segment with AI 300 laptops, and we know that all the reviewers are essentially really, really happy. It offers really good, let's say, energy efficiency, so improved battery life, improved performance, and also both in gaming, but also in productivity. We know that those new APUs with a 12-core AMD Zen 5 CPU is also beating essentially everything else on the market, and doing so at 28 watts. Just remember that those reviews that you saw on YouTube 2 days ago from Dave 2D and Linus Tech Tips and all the other review channels, that are 28 watt chip laptops. Just wait and see, how this chip will perform when it's fully fed, 50, 45 watts or even 60 watts. I think that's gonna, raise the bar another one step. So I think that the AMD's, let's say, client segment is gonna be really, really strong. And I kind of modeled that in my kind of expectations. Looking here, the second row here was Q1, and then here was 1,750 million for me. That I expected in the beginning, although I kind of lowered it down a bit later. But yeah, so we are not really at that level, but still, 1.5 billion essentially, really good. Although I would say that operating income could be a bit better, but still, 1.5 billion is really good. So, and we know that due to Moore's Law is dead YouTube channel, he's saying that some of the channels that are selling these CPUs to Dell or whatever kind of system solutions that are out there, they are saying that this is a historic launch for AMD. Never ever has AMD been so strong and in terms of performance and volume out there to the market on day one. So I think client is really good. But again, let's go back to data center, because that's where the bread and butter for AMD is. Before we do that, just quickly, you can see that if you follow on the tech news on the last couple of weeks, that Intel has huge issues with their defective 13th and 14th gen Raptor Lake CPUs, and that's going to affect their, let's say, earnings reports tomorrow, at least. Maybe not for tomorrow, but possibly the guidance. But this will definitely help AMD. This is going to play AMD right in their hands. And I think this is a good also additional point why AMD's client will be strong. But now let's go back to servers. I spoke about MI300. My thesis has always been that AMD is around 9 to 12 or even 18 months behind Nvidia. In 2023, Nvidia sold around 50 billion or 47 billion Nvidia H100s and H200 chips or whatever that was. And AMD, they sold around 4 to 500 million. The reason I say that number around half a billion is because in Q1, Lisa Su said that after Q1, they had sold 1 billion in total sales for MI300. Of that 1 billion, around 400 came in Q4 last year and 600 Q1 this year. So this is also something that you'll see in my full year 2024 expectations for Q1. These are numbers that I did before, a while back, but I assume that 650 million for Q1. And if you add those two numbers together, it's around 1 billion, 1.1 billion. So that's in line with what Lisa Su said in Q1. I increased that number to 800 million. And I do believe that there's reason to believe that this is actually way too conservative. Maybe we are, at 1 billion. I would say we are at least at 1 billion now. Looking at the data here, for example, you can see that data center revenue for AMD at almost 3 billion. And traditionally, you would see that AMD is, let's say, EPYC is their servers for CPU servers, the let's say general purpose CPUs that are traditionally meant for servers are 1.5 billion of these. That leaves around 1.3 billion for others, which is MI300. And we also see that it's an increase of 500 million US dollar compared to the previous quarter. And most likely, I'm kind of to believe that it's very with high confidence that essentially 90% of that increase from last quarter is MI300 ramping up. So yeah, I would say that I'm very confident now to increase these numbers in my projections from 800 to let's say 1.3 billion even. So if we increase that to 1.3 billion, so let's change that number quickly, 1.3, bam. That would leave us at a guidance for the full year of 2024 at 5.85 billion, let's say 6 billion US dollar, which in my opinion was kind of realistic going into this year with the number of, manufacturing capacity that AMD has bought from TSMC and the partners. And how do I say that? Well, if you look at CoWoS chip on wafer on substrate capacity that AMD purchased from TSMC, I did some calculations before looking into the yield, especially comparing MI300 to Nvidia's H100, looking at the die size, how many good dice per wafer we'll get, chips per wafer, and then also including whatever kind of defects we would have in the manufacturing for AMD. And I arrived at around, for this summer 2024 at 600 wafers for AMD. That would be around, let's say, 41,000 MI300s per month. But then if you take into account some defaults and defects, we were getting close to 30 to 35,000 and around 500 million of, let's say, revenue. Again, these are estimates. 500 million is based on 15,000. That number times 15,000. So 33,000 chips times 15,000 per chip. That's around 500 million. So with those numbers in mind, AMD right now sitting around 500 million and still kind of increasing their let's say ramping up. So if you look at that number, if we go back again to my estimations, quickly, a moment please here. Yeah, so there you'll see. If we are at 500 million right now, and I guess the Q2 earnings report that just came out kind of points to the fact, as I mentioned before, they managed to beat, by 500 million compared to Q1, which already beat the previous record. So I think we are safe to say that AMD is well above 1 billion already in Q2. But then again, let's go with 1.3, and then in Q3, I'm inclined to say, maybe we should increase this number as well. I'll actually, let's do it quickly. Let's do it to 2. So let's go with 2 billion. Now we are at 6.3. And even if I stick, with the Q4 numbers of 2.4 billion, we are around 6.4 billion US dollar in sales. Again, nowhere near Nvidia, not even close to their last year. But that's not, we are not competing with Nvidia. We're competing with AMD's last year. And that was 500 million. So this is, if these numbers are to be correct, we are, a 10xing compared to last year in terms of revenue. But this is really, you know, great numbers. Lisa Su mentioned in the last quarter that their guidance for full year is 4.5 billion. My estimations points to 6.5 billion at the bare minimum. You know, again, they are usually very conservative, and I think, you know, there's huge potential for Q4. It could easily be above 2.5, 3 billion. So we could even see a 7 billion or 7.5 billion. But let's go with 6.4. I think it's time for Lisa Su, and I think it's expected of Lisa Su to kind of increase the guidance of MI300, which is maybe not by a huge number. Maybe she'll increase it from 4.5 to 5.5 because she now has a visibility. We know that the lead time for MI300 and AMD is around 6 months compared to Nvidia's 1 year. So I think, you know, she has enough visibility now, essentially just the first day into August. And I think, you know, with that kind of visibility, and she's kind of usually conservative, let's go with 6 billion, 6.5 billion for full year expected, but she's gonna probably increase the guidance from 4.5 sales, MI300 sales, to 5.5. And that, I think, is what the market saw. You know, the stock has taken a beating for a while now. We are back in the after hours to 145, 146 US dollar. I think this is if nothing bad happens tomorrow in the general, you know, macroeconomics, but I think, you know, AMD found a nice bottom. If you look at again the EPS, so if you look back more at the numbers, so the EPS came in at let's have a quick number. Where do we find that? Earnings per share. There you go. So earnings per share at 0.69. Let's go with 0.7. You take that by 4. That's 2.83 US dollar. So if we just hold this pace, let alone, you know, increasing the pace that I mentioned before. But if we hold that pace at 2.8, let's go with 3 US dollar earnings per share for this kind of run rate that we had now in Q2. And if you take, let's take the calculator quickly. Stock price is at 145, let's say. 145 divided by 3. So that's what I said. The PE ratio is 48. But this doesn't, you know, include Q3 and Q4, which definitely will increase the EPS. I mean, just quickly looking at it, so I had some kind of rough estimations. If we go with these numbers, so let's play with it, you know, let's play with it, and let's go by, I don't know, let's go by 6.9 billion, 6.9. There we go. So that net income went from 1.15 to 1.65. So that's another 40% increase in the EPS. The EPS would come in close to almost $1, you know. And then in Q4, let's go with, I don't know, man. Let's go with Q4. Let's go with, let's have a quick number. Let's do 8 billion. Not too overly optimistic, but maybe somewhat optimistic. Let's increase the operating expenses 2 billion also, because not everything will be positive. Yeah. I would say, you know, let's go with 1.1 US dollar in EPS for Q4. So I think that's gonna cut, you know, let's again take 145 divided by 4 times 1, so that divided by 4. There we go. $36 PE ratio for this year, essentially, in run rate basis. And then, you know, by the time you get to those numbers, you're looking forward to 2025. So I think, you know, those people, you know, those analysts, some of them mentioning that AMD had a PE ratio of like 200, 250. I don't think they're seeing, you know, the actual numbers that AMD is performing. Mind you that these are numbers that they do despite some, you know, heavy Xilinx purchase amortizations and writing offs. So yeah, I think I'm very happy. I'm gonna jump over to the call now. I think everything that we wanted was there. And finally, let's have a look at the outlook for 2024 Q3. So they say, yeah, 6.7 plus minus 300. So let's go with 6.8. Gross margin somewhat increasing. Operating expenses increasing by, I think, 100 million compared to the guidance that they gave last quarter. Same kind of effective tax rate. Yeah, I think, you know, safe to say that we're gonna have, if they continue with these kind of numbers, which these are like very realistic with AMD, they rarely miss, you know, by big amount, especially on the downside. And I think, you know, we're already 1 month into Q3. So yeah, I think most of that, you know, increase will come from MI300, and most likely just before we finish, we can see that I think, you know, we could see well above 3 billion, well above maybe even 3.5, close to 4 billion of just data center on a revenue basis of 6.8 billion US dollar. So yeah, that's gonna be AMD's by far biggest, let's say, segment. To be honest, the only surprise for me is gonna be, you know, client. How well will it perform? Will we see another jump? AMD's client is in a really strong position. As I mentioned, AMD's, you know, APUs for Windows laptops are doing just great. We know that the Strix Point that launched now are so good compared to everything else on the market. So, I mean, honestly, this was hats off to you guys that you folks out there that saw this opportunity. Look at it, AMD is now 9%. So let's actually quickly see if Lisa said something. Easiest way to find that out is to go to the subreddit, best subreddit ever. I've spent too much time here over the past 8 years. So let's see, yes, MI300, as I mentioned before, exceeding 1 billion. Again, very good. Let's see what more did she say, because the stock started to run even more now. You know, we are up almost 9% now. So anything else that Lisa said? Let's do a final quick update before we finish this quick update of the earnings, and I do a big one tomorrow. And also, you know that I will be update about Intel's earnings tomorrow. So let's see, anything new? No, that's essentially, you know, the MI300. Again, everything is based on MI300. But as I mentioned, if we quickly go back to also my AMD's production capacity for MI300, on my calculation, we should expect around 650 million. So another, you know, 30% increase on a monthly basis compared to Q2, which would mean 1.8 to 2 billion US dollar. Yeah, I think just 2 billion US dollar at the minimum is realistic for AMD in Q3. I think that's I think that's possible, and that would give us, you know, 3.5-4 billion US dollar in data center. And with that, we could see on earnings, as I mentioned, around $1 US dollar per share. So thank you for watching. Congrats to all the AMD longs. Hopefully the stock will stay above these levels and start to climb up again. Again, this is not investor advice, but, you know, let's see you tomorrow about Intel. Thank you. Take care.